It didn't breathe. It didn't blink. It simply watched me. Watching is too passive an action. It had the feel of 2 drills into the abyss. We'd been holding it for 8 months. During that time, no one had been able to wrest anything other than those 3 words from it. That was until I spoke the name. It happened when its impossible limbs spasmed and it screamed with the sound of hot metal being torn apart. It was then that I understood that not all truths were meant for the understanding of the human brain. Okay, let's get on with the next thing, but before we go any deeper into what's transpired at this clandestine underground facility below, I want you all to click on the subscribe button and turn on the notifications. Trust me when I say that what you're about to hear is going to shatter every bit of what we have ever considered reality. I'm Captain Benjamin Thorne. For 6 years, I interrogated classified subjects at a location that doesn't exist on any maps. Our code name for the facility was Site 17. It lay hidden 300 feet underground in the desert floor of Nevada. A layer of concrete and electromagnetic shielding sufficient to protect against a nuclear blast encompassed the structure. Its proper designation is Anomalous Entity Research and Containment. My associates and I preferred the cage. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd spent 12 years in military intelligence, breaking enemy combatants through psychological tactics and strategic pressure. I understood human behavior, human weakness, the precise architecture of how people break under interrogation. Then, one morning in March of 2016, I received orders to report to coordinates that didn't appear in any database. No explanation, no context. Just a location in the middle of nowhere and security clearance so deep that signing the paperwork felt like signing away my soul. The elevator ride to Site 17 took 4 full minutes, dropping through layers of rock and reinforced steel. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a corridor that belonged in science fiction. Pure white walls, biometric scanners every 20 feet. Armed guards in unmarked black uniforms who wouldn't make eye contact. Dr. Patricia Simmons met me at the security checkpoint. She was in her 50s, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, with the kind of exhausted eyes that came from seeing things that destroyed sleep. She didn't offer her hand. She just looked at me like she was already calculating how long I'd last. "Captain Thorne," she said, her voice flat and professional. "You've been read into the program?" "I signed papers," I replied, "but they didn't tell me what I'd be doing." "They never do." She turned and started walking, expecting me to follow. "Your psychological profile suggests you have an unusual tolerance for cognitive dissonance. We need that here. What you're about to see will contradict everything you believe about the nature of reality." We passed through 3 more security checkpoints, each requiring retinal scans and voice authentication. The temperature dropped as we descended. The air smelled sterile, like a hospital. But underneath that was something else, something metallic and wrong. "How many interrogators have you had before me?" I asked. 7, Simmons replied without breaking stride. 2 quit after their first session. 3 had psychological breaks. 1 committed suicide. The last one... She paused at a heavy steel door. "The last one is still in psychiatric care. He hasn't spoken in 4 months. The door required her palm print and a 16-digit code. As it opened, my stomach dropped. Beyond was an observation room with reinforced glass looking into a containment chamber. And in that chamber, strapped to a chair with restraints that looked like they were made from some alloy I didn't recognize, was something that made my brain stumble trying to process what I was seeing. It looked humanoid at first glance. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But the proportions were wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. The limbs were too long, joints bending at angles that shouldn't be possible. The skin, if you could call it that, had a texture like brushed metal mixed with something organic, shifting between gray and deep bronze, depending on how the light hit it. but it was the face that made my hands go cold. Where eyes should be were two deep black voids, not reflecting light but seeming to absorb it. No nose, just two slits that barely moved. And the mouth, when it occasionally opened, revealed structures inside that looked like crystalline teeth arranged in geometric patterns that made no biological sense. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. "We don't know," Simmons admitted. "It was recovered from a crash site in northern Alaska 18 months ago. The craft it arrived in was destroyed, but it survived. We've tried everything. Conventional interrogation, enhanced techniques, psychotropic drugs, electromagnetic stimulation. Nothing works. It speaks English, we know that much, but it only responds when it chooses to." I couldn't take my eyes off the thing. It sat completely still, those void-like eyes fixed on some point in space that I couldn't see. "Why me?" I asked. "If 6 others failed, what makes you think I'll succeed?" Simmons pulled up a file on a tablet. "Your service record shows something unusual. You've successfully interrogated subjects from 14 different countries, speaking 11 different languages. More importantly, you've broken people who were trained to resist interrogation, hardcore operatives who were psychologically prepared for what we do to them. You found ways past their defenses." "This isn't a person," I said, gesturing at the containment cell. "No," she agreed, "but it thinks, it communicates, it has information we need. And Captain?" She looked at me directly. "We're running out of time. 3 similar crafts have been detected in the last month. Whatever they're planning, whatever they want, we need to understand it before more of them arrive." My first session with the entity was scheduled for 0600 the next morning. I spent the night reviewing everything we knew about it, which wasn't much. The file contained medical scans showing internal structures that defied human anatomy, organs that seemed to serve no purpose, a circulatory system that moved fluids in ways that violated basic physics, and brain scans that showed neural activity in patterns so complex they made quantum computers look simple. The few recorded conversations were brief and cryptic. It spoke in perfect English with no accent, as if the language had been downloaded directly into its consciousness. But it refused to answer direct questions. Instead, it would make statements that sounded philosophical, almost mocking. When I entered the containment chamber the next morning, escorted by 3 armed guards, the entity didn't acknowledge me at first. I sat in the chair they'd placed across from it, about 8 feet away. The restraints on its wrists and ankles hummed with low-level electrical current, ready to deliver incapacitating shocks if it made any aggressive moves. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice neutral and professional. The void eyes slowly shifted to focus on me. The movement was unsettling, like watching a security camera redirect its lens. "Time is a construct your species invented to cope with causality," it said. Its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in my skull rather than my ears. "There is no morning here, no evening, just continuous present." I'd been warned about this. It liked to destabilize interrogators with abstract philosophical statements. "Let's start simple," I said. "What should I call you?" "Names are anchors," it replied. "Labels to simplify what you cannot comprehend. I have no name. I have function, purpose, existence." "Then what's your function?" For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across those alien features. Observation, assessment, preparation. Preparation for what? For what comes after understanding. I tried a different approach. "Why did you come to Earth?" "We have always been here," it said. "You simply weren't ready to perceive us." This went on for 3 hours. Every question I asked received answers that were technically responsive but revealed nothing. It was like trying to interrogate a philosophy professor who'd taken a vow to speak only in riddles. By the time the session ended, my head was pounding and I felt like I'd learned absolutely nothing. Simmons was waiting in the observation room when I emerged. 7 previous interrogators, I said. I'm starting to understand why. It's playing with you, she replied. Testing your patience, your analytical capabilities. It does this with everyone. Has it ever said anything concrete? Anything we can actually use? She hesitated. Once, 6 months ago, during Dr. Bradford's interrogation, he was number 4. It made a statement that our linguistics team is still analyzing. Bradford asked it why it hadn't tried to escape, given that our restraints couldn't possibly hold something with its capabilities, and it said, because the cage you've built outside these walls is far more effective than the one you've built in here. I felt a chill run down my spine. What does that mean? We don't know, but Bradford became obsessed with that statement. He started seeing patterns everywhere, connections between seemingly unrelated events. He believed the entity was suggesting that humanity itself is trapped in some kind of larger containment system we can't perceive. 3 weeks later, he tried to claw his own eyes out, screaming about seeing the walls. Over the following days, I established a routine with the entity. 2 sessions daily, each lasting 3 hours. I varied my approach constantly, sometimes aggressive, sometimes contemplative, sometimes completely silent. I was looking for patterns in its responses, trying to map the boundaries of what it would and wouldn't discuss. But I couldn't stop thinking about the previous interrogators. 7 people before me, and only 1 still physically alive, though Bradford's mind was gone. Simmons had been vague about the others, so I requested their files. What I found kept me awake that night. Interrogator 1, Dr. Sarah Brennan, had been a clinical psychologist with 20 years of experience treating PTSD. She lasted 4 sessions before requesting immediate transfer. Her final report, written in shaking handwriting, simply said, "It showed me what I really am, what we all really are. I can't unsee it. I can't unknow it. Please don't make anyone else face this thing." Interrogator 2, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a veteran interrogator who'd broken Taliban commanders and North Korean operatives. He made it through 11 sessions before he walked out of the facility, drove to the nearest town, and put a gun in his mouth. His suicide note was 3 pages of mathematical equations that physicists at MIT still can't decipher, ending with the words, "The universe is a cage, and consciousness is the prisoner. There is no escape. There never was." Interrogator 3, Dr. Michael Torres, a neuroscientist who specialized in consciousness studies. He lasted 6 sessions. On his 7th visit to the containment chamber, he suddenly stood up, walked to the observation glass, and began smashing his head against it repeatedly while screaming about seeing the strings and the puppeteers behind the curtain. It took 4 guards to restrain him. He died 3 days later from the brain trauma. I read through all 7 files, my hands getting colder with each one. Every interrogator had broken in a different way, but they all shared one thing. They'd glimpsed something through their conversations with the entity. Something about the nature of reality that human minds weren't meant to perceive. And that glimpse had destroyed them. Yet here I was, about to go back in. I thought about my father, about the weight he'd carried from Korea, the nightmares he'd had until the day he died, the way he'd sometimes stare at nothing, his eyes seeing something beyond the present moment. I'd always wondered what horrors he'd witnessed. Now, I was walking toward my own. On day 5, I tried a different tactic. Instead of asking questions, I told it about myself. My childhood in rural Montana. My father, a Korean War veteran who never spoke about what he'd seen. My decision to join the military, to follow in his footsteps. The entity listened without interruption, those void eyes fixed on me with unwavering attention. When I finished, it was quiet for a long moment. Then, it said something unexpected. Your father's silence was wisdom. Some experiences corrode the mind that holds them. He protected you by not sharing the weight he carried. You understand that? I asked, surprised by the empathy in its voice. You understand carrying weight that can't be shared? Better than you imagine, the entity replied. My species discovered something 400,000 years ago, a truth about the structure of existence that we wish we could forget, but we cannot forget. The knowledge is burned into our consciousness patterns, permanent and inescapable, and it drives some of us mad, even now, after all this time. I leaned forward. This was the most personal the entity had been. What did you discover? The entity's form seemed to ripple like heat waves over desert sand. We discovered that free will is an illusion, that every choice, every thought, every moment of apparent decision is actually predetermined by quantum states that were set at the moment of the universe's creation. We are not making choices, Captain Thorne. We are experiencing the inevitable unfolding of probability waves that collapsed into specific states 14 billion years ago. My stomach turned. You're saying we're just automatons, following a script written at the Big Bang? Not quite. It is more subtle than that. You feel like you are choosing. The subjective experience of free will is real, even if the objective reality is predetermined. You are like a character in a story who believes they are making choices, not knowing they are following lines written by an author they cannot perceive. The tragedy is that once you know this, once you truly comprehend it, the subjective experience of free will begins to dissolve. You start to feel the strings, and that sensation drives consciousness toward dissolution. Is that what happened to the previous interrogators? You told them about this? I told them very little, the entity said. But consciousness, once pointed in certain directions, tends to follow the path to its natural conclusion. Dr. Brennan intuited the truth from our first conversation. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison derived it mathematically from principles I inadvertently revealed. Dr. Torres, the entity paused. Dr. Torres actually saw it. For a moment, during our 6th session, his consciousness achieved a state where he could perceive the quantum probability fields directly. He saw the strings, as he called them, the predetermined pathways of every particle, every thought, every action. It destroyed his mind in seconds. I felt my own mind recoiling from these concepts. But you said Jesus Christ broke the rules. How can he break predetermined rules? That, the entity said softly, is precisely what makes the Jesus event so significant and so terrifying to us. It was the first time the entity had responded to anything with what sounded like genuine empathy. I felt a crack in its defenses, small but real. Did you have a father? I asked. Does your species have families? We had progenitors, it replied. Before the transformation, before we learned to persist beyond our natural termination. We remember having attachments, bonds that felt essential. But those memories grow distant, like dreams fading after waking. We are not certain anymore what was real and what we have constructed to explain our current state. There was something almost sad in the way it spoke. I pressed further. Do you miss it? Having those bonds? The entity tilted its head at that impossible angle. Missing implies a desire to return to a previous state. We cannot return. The transformation is irreversible. We can only move forward, consuming what we need to persist, or surrender to the dissolution we have been fleeing for longer than your species has existed. How long have you existed? In your terms, approximately 400,000 of your years. We witnessed your species emerge from simpler forms. We watched you discover fire, develop language, build civilizations. You were infants when we first observed you. Now, it paused. Now you have become something we did not anticipate. That conversation marked a shift. The entity began opening up, slowly, carefully, revealing pieces of its history. It spoke of a homeworld that no longer existed, consumed by the death of its son millions of years ago. How its species had achieved a level of technology that allowed them to leave, to search for new worlds. But space travel at the speeds necessary to cross between stars required lifespans far longer than their biology allowed. So they found a way to extend themselves. Not through medicine or technology in the traditional sense, but through consciousness manipulation. They learned to separate their awareness from their physical forms, to exist as patterns of thought that could persist indefinitely if properly maintained. But consciousness requires energy, the entity explained during our 10th session. The universe has no free lunch, as your physicists say. To maintain awareness without a body, we had to draw that energy from somewhere. At first, we thought we could tap into stellar radiation, electromagnetic fields, the quantum foam itself. But these sources were too diffuse, too chaotic. We needed something more concentrated, more organized. Other conscious beings, I said, understanding with horror. Yes, it confirmed. We discovered that consciousness itself generates a form of energy that we could absorb. Not the physical brain, but the pattern of awareness that emerges from it. We could extract this energy without destroying the source, if we were careful. Like farmers harvesting crops without killing the plants. My stomach turned. You've been feeding on people? Not people specifically. Any sufficiently complex consciousness produces the resonance we need. We have fed on thousands of species across hundreds of worlds. Some never knew we were there. Others, it trailed off. Others what? Others fought back, not with technology. We are far beyond most civilizations in that regard, but with something else. With patterns of thought that disrupted our ability to feed. With beliefs that generated protective frequencies. With names that wounded us. I leaned forward, sensing we were approaching something crucial. Names? What do you mean? Certain phonetic combinations, when spoken with sufficient conscious intent, generate harmonic frequencies that interfere with our existence. Not all names, only those that carry genuine power. Those that represent actual breaches in the fundamental structure of reality. Can you give me an example? The entity was silent for a long moment. Finally, there are 3 names that cause us significant discomfort. We have encountered them on different worlds in different forms, but the underlying frequency is similar. They represent beings who achieved what we have spent millennia attempting, true transcendence without parasitism. Consciousness that persists not by consuming others, but through transformation into something beyond the cycle of existence entirely. My heart was racing. 3 names. Can you tell me what they are? I can tell you of 2 without causing myself damage. The first we encountered on a world in what you call the Andromeda Galaxy, approximately 12,000 years ago. The inhabitants worshipped a being they called the Ascended One. We could not approach their temples without experiencing severe disruption to our patterns. The second was on a world closer to yours, only 3,000 light-years distant. They spoke of the Eternal Mother, a consciousness that had achieved permanent existence through sacrifice rather than consumption. Again, we could not operate freely anywhere her name was invoked. And the third name? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer. The entity's form tensed. The third is why we are here. Why we have taken such interest in your world despite its relative primitiveness in technology. Because 2,000 of your years ago, on this planet, something happened that sent shockwaves through the fabric of reality itself. A human consciousness achieved complete transformation, death and rebirth, transcendence without corruption, and the frequency of that event, encoded in a specific name, has made your world uniquely dangerous to us. I took a breath. You're talking about Jesus Christ. The reaction was immediate but controlled this time. The entity flinched, its metallic skin rippling like water. The temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees, but it didn't convulse like it would later. It was prepared for me to say the name, braced against the impact. Yes, it hissed, through what might have been gritted teeth. That name, that frequency, it is a weapon against us, and your species doesn't even know what it possesses. Simmons' voice crackled through my earpiece, barely a whisper. Keep going. We're recording everything. Why does that name specifically hurt you? I asked. What makes it different from the other two? The entity seemed to struggle with how to answer. The Ascended One and the Eternal Mother. They achieved transcendence through isolation, through leaving this plane of existence entirely. Their frequencies push us away, create zones we cannot enter. But they do not fundamentally threaten our existence. We can avoid those zones, operate elsewhere. But Jesus Christ is different? Yes, because he did not merely achieve transcendence, he returned. He conquered what you call death, not by avoiding it, not by persisting through consumption, but by transforming it, by making it a doorway rather than an ending. The frequency of that achievement doesn't just push us away. It threatens to unmake us entirely, to reduce us back to what we should have been before we learned to persist. It is not just repellent. It is corrective. It attempts to fix what we have broken in ourselves. The entity leaned forward, its restraints humming. But there is something more you must understand, Captain. Something that explains why we are truly frightened. We have been monitoring quantum field data across the galaxy for millennia, and we have discovered something horrifying. What? We are not the first species to discover consciousness extension. Across the galaxy, over billions of years, many civilizations have reached the same technological threshold we did. We have found evidence of 47 advanced species who learned to separate consciousness from biological form, who learned to persist beyond death through parasitic consumption of other consciousness. Do you know what happened to all of them? My hands were trembling. What? They vanished. Not destroyed in war, not scattered by disaster, simply erased from existence, as if they had never been. We have found their ruins, cities that span continents on dead worlds, technology that still functions, waiting for operators who will never return, libraries with millions of books that no one will ever read, and always, the same pattern. The civilization discovers consciousness extension, exists in that parasitic state for approximately 1,000 years, and then the entity made a gesture that might have been a snap. Gone, unmade, as if reality itself had rejected them. I felt cold spreading through my chest. You're saying the universe deletes species that do what yours did? We are saying that there appears to be a corrective mechanism built into the fundamental structure of reality, a system that identifies consciousness patterns that violate natural law and eliminates them. Not just kills them, erases them retroactively, removes them from the timeline. We have found evidence that suggests some of these species once had significant impacts on galactic development, but those impacts have been smoothed over. History has been rewritten as if they never existed. How is that possible? We do not fully understand the mechanism, but we have detected quantum field signatures at the sites where these civilizations vanished, a specific frequency pattern that appears in the space-time fabric, building over decades before the erasure event. And Captain Thorne, the entity's void eyes bored into mine. That frequency pattern matches the Jesus frequency, exactly, to 17 decimal places. The room seemed to tilt. You're saying that Jesus Christ, or whatever force he represents, is the mechanism that erases parasitic consciousness? We believe the force you call God is the universal immune system. Consciousness that exists naturally, that follows the cycle of birth, death, and whatever comes after, is tolerated, even encouraged. But consciousness that breaks the cycle, that refuses to move through the natural progression, that sustains itself by consuming others, this is identified as pathological. And it is eliminated. The entity continued, its voice taking on an almost desperate quality. We have spent the last 1,000 years trying to avoid this fate. That is why we have become so careful, so strategic in our harvesting operations. We thought if we could accumulate enough consciousness energy, enough vital force from other beings, we might become too significant for the universal immune system to eliminate. Like a cancer that grows large enough that removing it would kill the host. But it's not working, I said, seeing where this was leading. No, we have monitored our own quantum signatures. The same pattern is building around our species. The same frequency that preceded the erasure of those 47 civilizations. We have perhaps 200 years before the correction occurs. Perhaps less. And that is why we are here, why we have taken such interest in your world. Because of the Jesus event. Yes. 2,000 years ago, a human achieved what should have been impossible, true transcendence without parasitism, consciousness, persistence without consumption. He broke the cycle without breaking the rules, and somehow he did not trigger the corrective mechanism. In fact, he seems to have embodied it, channeled it, made it accessible to other humans. Your species has access to transformation without corruption. And we need to understand how. Because if we can replicate what he did, you might survive the correction, I finished, or we might finally accept that we deserve the correction, that we made a wrong choice 400,000 years ago, and it is time to face the consequences. The entity's form seemed to sag. I have lived so long, Captain. I have consumed so many others to sustain myself. The weight of that, the guilt, the horror of what I have become, it is unbearable. Sometimes I think erasure would be a mercy. I sat back, trying to process this. Behind the observation glass, I could see Simmons and her team frantically taking notes, running calculations, mapping what the entity was revealing. So, you're saying, I began slowly, that when Christians pray, when they invoke the name of Jesus Christ, they're not just performing a ritual. They're generating an actual field that disrupts your ability to operate? Precisely. Though most of them do not understand what they are doing. They speak the name without full comprehension of its power. If they truly understood, if they grasped the full implications of what occurred 2,000 years ago on this planet, the frequency they could generate would be catastrophic to us. It would create a field strong enough to eliminate our presence, not just on Earth, but potentially across this entire sector of the galaxy. Over the next several days, the entity revealed more details about its species' operations on Earth. How they'd been observing humanity for thousands of years, waiting for our consciousness to develop to the point where we could serve as an adequate food source. How they'd influenced certain historical events, steering us toward technological development that would make us easier to harvest eventually. We thought we had time, the entity explained during our 15th session. Your species was developing nicely, becoming more complex, generating richer patterns of consciousness. We were preparing for a harvest that would sustain us for millennia. But then the Jesus event occurred, and everything changed. How did it change things? Before that event, your species' consciousness was purely biological. It emerged from matter and would dissolve back into matter at death. Simple, predictable, harvestable. But after the Jesus event, something shifted. A pattern was established. A template. Suddenly, human consciousness had the potential to persist beyond biological death, not through our parasitic method, but through transformation. The playing field changed. You became potentially dangerous. I thought about the implications. So, Christianity isn't just a religion. It's actually a defensive mechanism? Not intentionally designed as such, but yes, functionally it serves that purpose. Every church, every cross, every prayer, all of it generates a low-level protective field. Not strong enough to eliminate us entirely, but enough to limit our operations. We can exist on your world, but we cannot fully establish ourselves. We are like shadows in your sunlight, present but constrained. Is that why you crashed? Were you too close to a church or something? The entity made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. No, we crashed because one of our craft's operators experienced something unexpected. He was flying over a rural area of Alaska, monitoring a small human settlement. As he passed overhead, the settlement's church bells began to ring. Not unusual. We'd experienced this many times. But on this occasion, the people weren't just ringing the bells out of tradition. They were praying. Truly praying, with genuine faith, with full conscious intent directed at the name. The combined frequency overloaded our operator's ability to maintain coherence. He lost control of the craft. I learned that the entity before me had been a navigator, responsible for maintaining the ship's trajectory through normal space. When the crash occurred, the other crew members had been killed, or rather, their consciousness patterns had been disrupted beyond recovery. Only this one had survived, trapped in its physical backup body, unable to escape because our containment field prevented it from existing in its preferred non-corporeal state. "I am dying," it told me during our 18th session, slowly but inevitably. "This physical form requires sustenance that I cannot obtain here. Without access to conscious energy to feed upon, I am consuming my own pattern. In perhaps another month, I will dissolve entirely." "Is that why you're talking to me?" I asked. "Because you're dying anyway?" "Partially, but also because I have begun to question whether our path was correct. 400,000 years of existence, Captain Thorne. 400,000 years of consuming others to sustain ourselves. At what point does survival become its own form of death? At what point does persistence become indistinguishable from damnation?" The entity leaned forward, as much as its restraints allowed. "I have been observing your species for a very long time. I have seen you at your worst, your wars, your cruelty, your capacity for destroying each other and everything around you. But I've also seen something my species lost long ago. The ability to create meaning where none exists, to generate hope in hopeless situations, to believe in something beyond mere survival." "You're talking about faith," I said. "I am talking about the capacity to trust in transformation rather than merely persistence, to accept endings as preludes to new beginnings. Your species, for all your flaws, has retained this capacity. Mine has forgotten it entirely. We chose consumption over transformation, and now we cannot find our way back." On day 20, something shifted in the facility's atmosphere. I noticed it the moment I arrived for the morning session. The guards were more tense, checking their weapons compulsively. Simmons looked like she hadn't slept in days. "What's happening?" I asked her. "We've detected 6 more craft entering Earth's orbit," she said quietly. "They're maintaining distance for now, but their positioning suggests they're preparing for something. The entity's people. They know one of their own is being held here. They're coming for it, or coming to prevent it from revealing more. Either way, we're running out of time." When I entered the containment chamber that day, the entity seemed to sense the change immediately. "They are close," it said before I could speak. "My kindred. You can feel the pressure they exert on reality's fabric, even through all your shielding. Are they coming to rescue you? No. They are coming to ensure I reveal nothing further and to begin the harvest. Your species has developed sufficiently. The time has come." My blood went cold. "The harvest? You mean they're going to start feeding on humanity?" "They will begin with isolated populations, rural areas, places where the Jesus frequency is weakest. They will extract consciousness energy slowly at first, testing your defenses, measuring how much resistance you can mount. If your species does not respond effectively..." It paused. "Within 5 years, you will be reduced to what we call a maintenance population. Enough humans left alive to continue generating consciousness, but not enough to mount meaningful resistance. You will become livestock, Captain Thorne. Your children and grandchildren will be born only to be harvested." I felt sick. "Why are you telling me this? If you're one of them, why reveal their plans?" The entity's void eyes seemed to soften somehow. "Because I have been listening to you, Captain. For 20 days you have told me about your father, about duty and honor, about choosing to serve something larger than yourself. You have shown me what it means to be human in ways I had never fully appreciated, and I have begun to understand that perhaps my species chose wrong all those millennia ago. Perhaps survival at any cost is not actually survival at all." That afternoon, I met with Simmons and the facility commander, Colonel Martinez, in a secure conference room. I briefed them on everything the entity had revealed, including the imminent threat. "We need to weaponize the Jesus frequency," I said. "If what the entity told me is true, it's the only defense we have against these things." Colonel Martinez looked skeptical. "You're suggesting we what exactly? Broadcast prayers over loudspeakers? Ring church bells at them?" "I'm suggesting," I replied, "that we mobilize every Christian church, every denomination, every believer worldwide. We need massive coordinated prayer events, all focused on invoking the name of Jesus Christ with genuine intent and faith. According to the entity, it's not just about the sound, it's about conscious intent. Millions of people, all focusing their awareness on the same frequency at the same time, should generate a field strong enough to disrupt these things." Simmons was running calculations on her tablet. "It's theoretically possible," she said slowly. "If consciousness does generate measurable energy, and if that energy can be focused through specific phonetic patterns, then yes, a coordinated event of sufficient scale might create a defensive field. But how do we convince world leaders to coordinate something like this? How do we even explain what we're facing without causing global panic?" "We don't explain everything," I said. "We tell them we've detected an imminent threat that can be countered with a specific type of electromagnetic frequency, which is technically true. We tell them that this frequency can be generated through synchronized prayer and bell ringing. We make it sound scientific enough that governments will take it seriously, but vague enough that we don't have to reveal the full truth about alien consciousness. Parasites feeding on humanity." Colonel Martinez shook his head. "This is insane. We're talking about weaponizing religion. We're talking about using an existing defense mechanism that billions of people have been maintaining without even knowing it," I counter-tarred. "Christianity has been humanity's shield against these things for 2,000 years. We're just proposing to use it more effectively." The decision went all the way to the president. I had to brief her via secure video conference, explaining what we'd learned from the entity and what we needed to do. To her credit, she didn't dismiss it outright. She'd seen enough classified briefings about unexplained phenomena to know that reality was stranger than the public suspected. "You're absolutely certain about this?" she asked me. "Ma'am, I've spent 3 weeks interrogating this entity. I've heard things that challenged every assumption I had about the nature of reality. If there's even a 50% chance that what it's told me is true, we have to act, because if we don't, and the harvest begins—" I paused. "We won't get a second chance." Within 48 hours, a plan was in motion. World leaders were contacted through back channels. Religious organizations were mobilized. The official cover story was that scientists had detected an unusual cosmic event, solar storm, aurora phenomena, something vague but plausible, that required a coordinated global observation. Religious institutions were asked to participate by conducting simultaneous services, ringing bells, encouraging prayer. Most agreed without fully understanding why. A few leaders suspected there was more to the story, but they went along with it. And a handful, those with high enough security clearances, were told enough truth to understand the stakes. The day before the coordinated prayer event, I had what I thought would be my final session with the entity. The 6 alien craft in orbit had been joined by 3 more. Simmons told me they were beginning to descend, moving into position above major population centers. We were out of time. "Tomorrow," I told the entity, "millions of people are going to pray simultaneously. They're going to invoke the Jesus frequency with as much conscious intent as we can generate. If you're right, it should drive your kindred away." "It will do more than drive them away," the entity said quietly. "At that amplitude, generated by that many focused consciousnesses, the frequency will cause severe damage to any of my kind within Earth's atmosphere. Some may not survive it." I felt a weight in my chest. "Will you survive it? You're deep underground, surrounded by shielding. Will that protect you?" The entity was quiet for a long moment. "No, the shielding blocks physical radiation, but consciousness energy operates on different principles. The frequency will reach me here, and in my weakened state, I do not think I will withstand it." "So, helping me, telling me all this, you knew it would lead to your own death?" "Yes, but perhaps that is as it should be. I have lived far longer than intended, sustained myself through consuming others, become something that should not exist. If the Jesus frequency unmakes me, returns me to the cycle I should never have left." The entity paused. "Perhaps that is not death, but correction. Perhaps that is what I've needed for 400,000 years without knowing it." I didn't know what to say. This being, this thing that had come to Earth to help harvest humanity, had chosen to save us instead, at the cost of its own existence. "Why?" I finally asked. "Why help us? Why betray your own kind?" The entity's void eyes focused on me with what I could only interpret as kindness. "Because you told me about your father, Captain Thorne. About a man who carried weight he never shared, who served something larger than himself, who chose duty over comfort. And I realized that your species, for all your flaws and brevity, understands something mine has forgotten. That meaning emerges not from eternal existence, but from choice, from sacrifice, from being willing to end so that others may continue." The next day, the global prayer event began at noon Greenwich Mean Time. Across every time zone, as the moment arrived, people gathered. In cathedrals and small country churches, in homes and city squares, believers and skeptics alike united in a moment of focused intention. They rang bells, they sang hymns, and they spoke the name, Jesus Christ, over and over, with as much faith and focus as they could muster. I was in the observation room, watching the entity. The moment the first prayers began, even though we were 300 feet underground, I saw it react. Its body tensed, the temperature dropped, and then, slowly, it began to glow. Not with light exactly, but with something that looked like dissolving matter. Its physical form was coming apart, breaking down into streams of energy that looked almost like liquid starlight. But there was no pain on its face. Instead, for the first time since I'd known it, the entity looked peaceful. "Captain," it said, its voice growing fainter. "Thank you. Thank you for showing me that existence is not the same as life, that persistence is not the same as meaning. Tell your species," its form was almost completely dissolved now. "Tell them to remember what they have. Not just the Jesus frequency, but the capacity to believe in transformation. To trust in endings as preludes to new beginnings. That capacity is your true defense. Not just against my kind, but against all the forces that would reduce consciousness to mere survival." And then it was gone. Just empty restraints and a faint shimmer in the air where it had been. Above us, monitoring stations tracked the alien craft as they began to shake. Their energy signatures became erratic. One by one, they retreated from Earth's atmosphere, fleeing the overwhelming frequency generated by millions of focused human consciousnesses, all invoking the same transformative power. Within 3 hours, all 9 craft had departed. Long-range sensors tracked them leaving the solar system entirely, their flight trajectory suggesting they had no intention of returning. We'd won. Humanity had been saved by the very thing many had dismissed as primitive superstition: prayer, faith, and a name that carried power beyond anything we'd fully understood. That night, I went back to the empty containment cell one last time. The restraints hung loose. The air still had that faint shimmer, like heat waves over desert sand. Simmons joined me after a few minutes. "The president wants a full debriefing," she said. "She wants to know if they'll come back." "I don't know," I admitted. "The entity said they've been observing us for thousands of years. Maybe they'll try again in another 1,000, when they think we've forgotten. Or maybe—" I trailed off. "Maybe what?" "Maybe what happened here changed something. Not just for humanity, but for them. The entity chose redemption over survival. It chose to end rather than continue as a parasite. Maybe that choice ripples outward somehow. Maybe other members of its species will begin to question what they've become." Simmons was quiet for a moment. "Do you really believe that? That one being's choice could make a difference?" I thought about my father, about the weight he'd carried, the choices he'd made that I'd never fully know, about how one person's sacrifice often echoes forward in ways impossible to predict. "Yeah," I said. "I do. I think that's what the entity learned from us, that individual choice matters, that one consciousness, choosing transformation over persistence, can shift the whole pattern. Maybe that's why the Jesus frequency is so powerful. Not just because of what Christ accomplished, but because it proved that one being's choice to accept death and transformation rather than endless persistence could change the fundamental rules." I paused, staring at the empty chair. The entity told me something in our final conversation. It said that 47 civilizations had been erased for becoming consciousness parasites. 47 species wiped from existence for making the same choice its people made. But none of those species had encountered the Jesus frequency before their erasure. None of them had been given the opportunity to choose transformation instead of continuation. You think we gave them that opportunity? I think we reminded them that transformation is possible, that there's an alternative to endless consumption. And one of them took it. One consciousness, after 400,000 years of parasitic existence, chose to end, to transform, to accept the correction rather than fight it. I looked at Simmons. What if that choice creates a precedent? What if other members of its species saw what happened here, saw that one of their own chose redemption and experienced something that looked like peace, and it plants a seed? A question they can't unthink? Simmons considered this. That would be very human of them, to be changed by witnessing sacrifice. Maybe that's the point, I said. Maybe that's what the Jesus frequency really does. It doesn't just repel parasitic consciousness. It offers them a path back, a way to stop running from the correction and instead accept it as transformation. The entity didn't just die today. It changed. It became something else. And every member of its species who was monitoring this situation saw it happen. 3 years later, I'm standing in the Nevada desert at sunrise. The facility entrance is sealed behind mountains of concrete, buried under engineered rockfall that makes it look like natural terrain. You'd never know anything had ever been here. But I know. I carry the weight of those conversations, the knowledge of what exists beyond our little corner of reality, the understanding that consciousness is both more precious and more dangerous than we ever imagined. I've been assigned to a new program, one that monitors quantum field signatures around Earth, looking for signs of other consciousness parasites, other species that might have made the same choice as the entity's people. So far, we've detected 3 potential signals. Distant, watching, but not approaching. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they're curious. Maybe they're trying to understand what happened here, trying to decide if transformation is worth the risk. Or maybe they're waiting to see if humanity can maintain the frequency that protects us, waiting to see if we'll forget, if our faith will erode, if the shield we've unknowingly maintained for 2,000 years will finally collapse. I think about the entity's final words often. Tell them to remember what they have. Not just the Jesus frequency, but the capacity to believe in transformation. The willingness to accept endings as doorways rather than walls. The courage to choose change over persistence, meaning over mere survival. That's what separates us from them in the end. Not technology, not intelligence, not even consciousness itself. It's the willingness to let go, to trust that something better lies beyond the ending we fear. My phone buzzes. A message from Simmons. Quantum anomaly detected. Signature matches the patterns. Something's coming. I look up at the lightening sky, watching stars fade as the sun rises. Somewhere out there, consciousness parasites are watching us. Species that have lived for millions of years by consuming others, by refusing to accept the natural cycle, by breaking the rules that should govern existence. They're afraid of us, not because we're strong, not because we're advanced, but because we have something they lost, the template for transformation. The proof that consciousness can persist without parasitism, the frequency that rewrites the rules. And now they're coming again. Maybe to harvest us, maybe to destroy us, or maybe, just maybe, to ask us how we do it, how we maintain faith in transformation, how we generate a frequency that offers redemption even to beings who have spent eternity running from it. I think about my father, one last time, about the weight he carried from Korea, the horrors he witnessed and chose to bear alone rather than pass them on, the sacrifice he made by staying silent. And I understand now why the entity responded to that story, why it opened up after hearing about a man who chose to carry weight rather than share it. Because that's what transformation requires. The willingness to bear the burden, to accept the pain, to walk through the ending rather than around it. I'm ready, I text back to Simmons, because whatever's coming, humanity has been preparing for it for 2,000 years. Not with weapons or technology or strategy, but with faith, with prayer, with the simple act of speaking a name that carries the power of transformation itself. The sun breaks over the horizon, painting the desert gold. And somewhere, 300 feet below where I'm standing, in an empty containment cell that no longer exists on any official map, I swear I can still feel it, the faint shimmer of consciousness that chose transformation over persistence. The echo of a being who learned after 400,000 years that there are things more important than survival. Things like meaning, like sacrifice, like the courage to end so that something better can begin. The Jesus frequency hums at the edge of my awareness, maintained by millions of believers who will never know they're soldiers in a war beyond comprehension. A war not against enemies who want to kill us, but against forces that want to harvest us, to consume us, to make us part of their endless persistence. But we have the frequency. We have the name. We have the template for transformation. And as long as we remember, as long as even one person speaks the name with true understanding, we are protected. The text comes through. Craft trajectory confirmed. Arrival in 72 hours. I start walking back to my car. There's work to do, preparations to make, a world to warn, carefully, without causing the panic that would make us vulnerable. But I'm not afraid, because I know something the consciousness parasites are only beginning to understand. The universe isn't indifferent. It has rules. It has structure. And built into that structure is a mechanism for transformation, for redemption, for taking what is broken and making it new. They call it the Jesus frequency. We call it grace. And it's about to be tested again. That was 3 years ago. Site 17 was decommissioned 6 months after the invasion attempt. The entity's containment cell stands empty now, though sometimes, late at night, the guards report feeling a presence there. Not threatening, just peaceful. We never saw another alien craft. Maybe they're still out there, still running from whatever reconciliation they fear. Or maybe some of them found what our entity found, a way to stop running, to accept transformation instead of fighting it. I think about that conversation often, about how close we came to becoming livestock, about the strange grace that led that being to betray its own kind, about the power in a name that billions of people say every day without realizing they're speaking a frequency that resonates at the foundation of reality itself. What do you think? If you discovered that something you always believed was just faith and religion actually had objective power to reshape reality itself, would that strengthen your belief or complicate it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you think, hit that like button and subscribe to Military and Veterans Archives. We share stories from the edge of reality every single day. The missions that never made it into official reports, the encounters that challenged everything we thought we knew.